CBM. In response, Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina said this morning that President Trump would be willing to use the last resort on Kim Jong-un's regime.
There will be a war with North Korea over their missile program if they continue to try to hit America with an ICBM.
If that weren't frightening enough, Russia is threatening Eastern Europe as it prepares for a large-scale military drill along the borders of NATO countries, which has some worried that could be a Trojan horse. Let's bring in CNN's Barbara Starr. Barbara, how concerned is the Pentagon right now?
Well, look, Jake, both North Korea and Russia are reaching the boiling point in their relations with the U.S., but what the Pentagon wants is a diplomatic solution. Russian President Vladimir Putin cheered by naval forces as the country prepares for a large-scale military exercise on the border of NATO countries.
Today, the naval fleet carries out not only its traditional tasks, but also capably meets new challenges.
The head of U.S. Special Operations Forces warning of a new threat from the Russian military.
The point of concern for most of the Eastern Europeans right now is they're about to do an exercise in Belarus, Russia, that's going to entail up to 100,000 Russian troops moving into that country. The great concern is they're not going to leave. And that's not paranoia, that's active concern.
Even the Secretary General of NATO doesn't believe Moscow's claim it's only sending 13,000 troops.
We have every reason to believe that it may be substantially more troops participating than the official reported numbers.
It's a Russian move that can't be ignored, experts say.
There has to be a strategy. What will we do? What will we put up with?
And that's just one crisis for the West Wing that new White House Chief of Staff, retired General John Kelly, is now running. In North Korea, the U.S. continues to say it's not looking for regime change.
We are not your enemy. We're not your threat. But you are presenting an unacceptable threat to us, and we have to respond.
But after 2 intercontinental ballistic missile launches and growing North Korean submarine operations, U.S. satellites, aircraft, and submarines are gathering every snippet of imagery, electronic intercepts, and radar readings. It could all help the U.S. get a vital heads up. Military options for North Korea have been updated, as CNN previously reported. They're aimed at a rapid response if there is an imminent threat of a North Korean missile attack or use of a nuclear device. The Pentagon is adamant about making diplomacy work. But a key Senate Republican hawk says he was told by President Trump conflict is always a possibility.
He has told me that. I believe him. I'm saying it's inevitable unless North Korea changes. If there's going to be a war to stop him, it will be over there.
Earlier today, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson said the U.S. would be willing to sit down with North Korea, but only if it relinquishes its nuclear weapons. Jake?
Barbara Starr at the Pentagon for us today. Thank you. Turning to another international crisis in Venezuela. Democracy is in shambles. Politicians who spoke out against current President Nicolas Maduro were yanked out of their homes by authorities in midnight raids as violent anti-government protests leave demonstrators injured and killed. The U.S. has imposed new sanctions on Venezuela following what critics call a sham election called by Maduro to consolidate his power. But will sanctions be enough? Let's bring in CNN's Leila Santiago in Caracas. And Leila, have you seen any sign that Maduro might be able to be deterred by these sanctions?
Well, you know, I think those the overnight developments are a sign that he is not being deterred at this time, that he is being emboldened in taking some of these opposition leaders in the middle of the night, some while still in pajamas. These are big names among the opposition. These are the faces that you see on T-shirts, on posters, out on the protests. So in the question of is Maduro being deterred at this very hour by sanctions, by protests, by international pressure, well, it seems that it's actually emboldening him. Jake?
The new sanctions target President Maduro's assets. Could those help stop him potentially?
So there are a number of sanctions on the table right now. Last week, President Trump sanctioned individuals that are tied to President Maduro. Now President Maduro has been sanctioned, and his reaction was, I am not a stray dog. I don't just wag my tail for anything, and I will not give in on Venezuela's sovereignty. So these sanctions against President Maduro don't seem to be stopping him or having him bow down in any way. It's certainly something that could impact him personally when it comes to personal banking and any business he may have or any assets he may have in the United States, which at this point is unclear what that may be. But in terms of his statements that he's making publicly and his move forward with this new assembly that could give him more power, that could essentially get rid of the assembly that is opposition controlled, he is moving forward on those hour by hour.
And there's talk in the administration right now, in the Trump administration, about potentially sanctioning Venezuela's oil. That, of course, could be a double-edged sword.
Right, because, and we've talked to people on the streets, I even talked to someone from the Trump administration who actually said that very phrase, double-edged sword, because Venezuela has the largest oil reserve in the world. It was once one of the richest countries in Latin America because of that oil reserve. So if he sanctions the oil, and the United States buys a lot of oil from Venezuela, it may actually hurt the economy and the government as well. And this is an economy, Jake, that, as you know, as we've reported, it's already suffering. You combine inflation with food and medical shortages, and it's a very, very bad situation for Venezuelans on the streets.
All right, Leila Santiago in Caracas for us. Thank you so much. An explosive lawsuit claims that the White House weighed in on a since retracted Fox News smear of a murdered DNC staffer. Now the White House is responding to the lawsuit. That's next.
Hello? No one asked us to go into the chaos.
Hello.
Into the heartbreak.
Welcome.
Expressed many concerns with President Trump, not only on policy, but also just basic human decency. He says conservatives have been complicit in the rise of Trump and Trumpism.
Well, I think that's true. But listen, I always thought August was going to be make or break time for people like Jeff Flake, who are reluctant to support Trump. We have to remember Flake didn't go to the convention. He's never been, a pro-Trump Republican. But Republicans were willing to give Trump time to see if he could pass major, efforts like repealing Obamacare, like tax reform. And now we're at August, where people have to go home and talk to their constituents and also consider how they're going to position themselves for 2018 campaigns. So throughout this month, you will see more people than Jeff Flake figure out how to position themselves, and I think you see a battle emerging of who is to blame for the lack of accomplishments. You saw Sarah Huckabee Sanders at the podium today sort of blaming the Republican Congress. You saw Jeff Flake here blaming Trump. Who's going to win that fight will be very important to see going forward.
Abby, let's turn to the bombshell from your newspaper today, the Washington Post, reporting that not only did President Trump sign off on that initial misleading statement from Donald Trump Jr., he dictated it. And Sarah Huckabee Sanders from the podium took issue with the idea of a dictation, but did acknowledge that the president weighed in. It was a misleading statement, but Sarah Huckabee Sanders said it wasn't. Here is the president's lawyer, Jay Sekulow, talking before the story came out about whether or not President Trump had a hand in it.
The president didn't sign off on anything. He was coming back from the G20. The statement that was released on Saturday was released by Donald Trump Jr., and I'm sure in consultation with his lawyers. The president wasn't involved in it. I wasn't involved in the statement drafting at all, nor was the president. I'm assuming that was between Mr. Donald Trump Jr., between Don Jr., and his lawyer. I'm sure his lawyer was involved. That's how you do it. But I do want to be clear that the president was not involved in the drafting of the statement and did not issue the statement.
I mean, obviously, Jay Sekulow was either not telling the truth or, I think more likely, had not been told the truth.
And I think that it's important to note that on some of those occasions he volunteered that the president wasn't involved in drafting it, which I think reflects how damaging this revelation really is for them. It suggests that Trump was the person who wanted to pull back from full transparency. Our reporting basically states that there were other lawyers and advisors involved who knew that more information would come out that would make a less than fulsome statement seem evasive and like an effort to cover something up. So they wanted to put it all out there. The president was the one who overruled them, and that's the critical decision-making point here. You can call it dictating, you can call it weighing in, you can call it whatever you want. The question is, who decided not to say what happened that day, and who decided to put out a statement that eventually was proven to be categorically false? The meeting was not about Russian adoptions. It was about damaging information on Hillary Clinton, and that's the reason that the meeting ended up on Don Jr.'s calendar.
And Paul, I mean, you and I are old dogs, and we've seen a lot of people come in and out of this town. Get it all out. Get it all out on your own terms. Get it all out as soon as possible.
Right, and according to the reporting in Abby's paper, the president was advised that, and it is true. Everything comes out. Believe me, I've lived through this. Everything comes out. Stuff you never want to know about comes out. So go ahead and say it. If in fact it was benign, but it wasn't about adoption, say it. And it's really telling that according to the sources that the Post has, the president was advised to be completely transparent and go ahead and put it all out, and he decided not to. That's a huge problem. It's not a crime to lie to the Washington Post, okay? It isn't.
Or to lie to the public is really what it is.
It is lying to the public, and that is terrible, but that's not obstruction of justice, but it is a cover-up. It is. He was clearly directing a cover-up of what happened in that meeting. Let's say it was about adoption, even though we now know it was a meeting with Russian agents to seek dirt on Hillary Clinton.
Yeah, I just want to raise one other point here. It is also legally problematic to use taxpayer resources to not only protect your son from legal trouble, but to protect him from activities he conducted on behalf of a campaign. That gets into Hatch Act violations. If he brought other federally paid staff into that discussion and used their resources aboard Air Force One to protect his son from campaign activities that are getting him in trouble, that opens up a whole other door to problems not only for Trump, his family, but staff as well.
Abby, I mean, as Sarah Huckabee Sanders said today, the president weighed in on the statement, quote, like any father would. I'm not sure that that's true, but...
I'm not sure that that's true, and it's certainly not true in the context of a criminal investigation. I mean, I think this is ultimately, if we take a step back here, that's what this is about. This is a criminal investigation that involves him and his family, and there were attorneys involved who advised him not to do this, and the president did not take that advice. It reflects the idea that a lot of people around him do not believe that he's fully cognizant of how serious this all is at the end of the day.
Amanda, Abby, Paul, thanks one and all. Appreciate your being here. President Trump tested by foreign powers, finding no easy answers as Russia flexes its military muscle on the border of key U.S. allies, and North Korea pushing the nuclear limits. That story ahead. Your book, the subtitle is A Rejection of Destructive Politics and a Return to Principle. You just talked about some of the principles that you think conservatives need to get back to. Let's talk about the rejection of destructive politics, because you're quite critical in the book, and also you have been critical in real life about some of the things that President Trump has said. His mockery of a disabled reporter. I could go on, but it's only an hour-long show. What do you think political leaders need to do when he does things that are indecent?
Well, let me just say, this didn't start with President Trump.
Absolutely not.
I was in the House from 2001 to 2012, or 13. During that time, we had a Republican stand up during President Obama's State of the Union and yell, "You lie," famous episode. We've seen things like this, and I talk about in the book when Gabby Giffords got shot. A year later, she came back during the State of the Union. She was going to resign the next day. And I sat with her, and she couldn't stand on her own still at that time, and so I helped her up during the President's applause lines, President Obama's applause lines. I started getting texts and emails from Republicans saying, "Why are you standing? The President is speaking. Do you agree with the President?" And just this shirts versus skins attitude that really predates President Trump. But I think we've just gotten coarser and coarser. And I talk a lot about it in the book, things like the birtherism that was put forward. I think that was awful.
By President Trump, mainly. He was one of the biggest proponents of it.
He was one of the sheriff in Arizona was Sheriff Joe Arpaio.
Sure.
Sent investigators to Hawaii,
Yeah.
And then had a press conference after he was defeated, still saying it was a forged birth certificate. This was in December of last year. A terrible thing to do and to prolong. And I think that the rejection of destructive politics, we've got to reject that. And it, as a conservative, I mean, that's just not what conservatives should do. And I mean, we've got huge problems to solve in this country. The biggest, in my view, is our looming debt and growing deficit. We have $20 trillion in debt. We'll be over $1 trillion a year in deficits here coming up soon. And we know that the only way to solve that is for both parties to sit down and share the risk. Every decent budget agreement we've had in the past 40 years is when Republicans and Democrats, you know, Reagan and Tip O'Neill, or the Graham-Rudman-Hollings Act, or budget deal of 1997, when Republicans and Democrats have said, all right, let's share the risk and do it together. And to say you're conservative and then say, I'm not even going to deal with entitlement spending, we'll put that off. We can't do that anymore. And we've got to sit down, Republicans and Democrats. You need 60 votes in the Senate to do just about anything. If you're not under reconciliation, and we're going to be there soon, and we should keep that. The President is calling for us to get rid of the filibuster. That would be an awful thing. The Senate is at its best when we work together on these things.
So your being outspoken doesn't come with a potential price. President Trump has reportedly been talking with people about getting challengers, Republican challengers, to run against you. Politico is reporting the White House officials have met with at least 3 possible primary challengers against you. You're running for re-election next year. How worried are you that doubling down on your outspokenness on these issues with this book might cost you your political career?
Well, I think some things are more important than a political career. I think, yeah, it would have been probably politically smarter to wait until you're safely re-elected to write a book like this. But then it wouldn't mean as much. If you don't have anything to risk politically, it doesn't mean as much. And I felt that it was important enough to stand up and write this. And so I've done it.
And there are critics out there on your left who say, right, talk is cheap, writing this book is one thing, what are you going to do about it? What are you going to do?
Well, like I said, I've reached across the aisle. I've worked on the so-called Gang of 8 when I first came to the Senate.
On immigration
spent a lot of
reform.
time. Yeah, and we're going to have to do that. We're going to have to sit down together. I partnered with Tim Kaine to do a bipartisan AUMF, authorization for use of military force. To prove that Republicans and Democrats can get along, I marooned myself on an island with Martin Heinrich, a Democrat senator from New Mexico, to rival survival to show that Republicans and Democrats can get along. If
you worked with Democrats on Cuba, too, with the Obama administration.
I have. And I have agreed with President Obama on Cuba policy. I've disagreed with this president. And one thing that I should point out, too, I came to Congress, in 2001, disagreed with President Bush on No Child Left Behind, prescription drug benefit, disagreed with him for 8 years on Cuba policy, and yet a couple of months ago he came to Arizona and did a fundraiser for me because we agreed on most issues and worked together on most issues. We've got to get away from this attitude that you have to agree with the president and that a senator should be a rubber stamp for everything the president wants at all times. I will agree with this president when I think he's doing conservative things and doing decent things, and I'll oppose him and speak up when I think that he isn't. And I think that's what Arizona voters expect me to do.
The book is Conscience of a Conservative by Senator Jeff Flake. Thanks so much for being here. We really appreciate it. Don't go before you sign my copy. Thanks so much, Senator. Coming up, a big election, and now opposition leaders snatched from their homes in the dead of night, rampant violence, and more chaos in oil-rich Venezuela. We're going there live. Stay with us.
Choose to go. So in response to that, the acting administrator of the Drug Enforcement Agency sent an email to all of his agents that reads, in part, "In writing to you, I seek to advance no political, partisan, or personal agenda, nor do I believe that a special agent or task force officer of the DEA would mistreat a defendant. I know that you would not, so why do I write? I write to offer a strong reaffirmation of the operating principles to which we as law enforcement professionals adhere. I write because we have an obligation to speak out when something is wrong. That's what law enforcers do." I'm Brooke Baldwin. Thanks for being with me. The Lead with Jake Tapper starts now.
A major admission from the White House just now. President Trump, quote, weighed in on that misleading statement from Donald Trump Jr. about his meeting with the Russians. The Lead starts right now. Amid all that, one lawmaker's searing indictment of his own party, Senator Jeff Flake speaking his mind and then some, railing against President Trump, saying his GOP colleagues are in denial. But will Flake's words lead to any real action? Senator Flake will join us live this hour. Two potentially explosive crises overseas. One, a stark warning of war, as Senator Lindsey Graham paints a terrifying picture of the dwindling options with a nuclear North Korea. Then, what in the world is Russia up to near the border of several NATO countries, and why is Putin stockpiling so much military gear there? And then, is this the ultimate fake news tale? A new lawsuit alleging the White House may have helped concoct a huge fake news story along with Fox News, exploiting crackpot conspiracy theories and smearing a young murdered DNC staffer. But can the details of this lawsuit be believed?
This is CNN Breaking News.
Welcome to The Lead, and we begin with breaking news in our money lead from Wall Street. Let's take a live look at the big board where the Dow Jones Industrial Average closed just shy of an all-time high of 22,000. The Dow, as well as the NASDAQ and S&P, has hit record highs in July despite turmoil in Washington and international tensions. Excuse me. The president tweeted about the Dow this morning saying, quote, "Stock market could hit all-time high again. 22,000 today, was 18,000 only 6 months ago on election day. Mainstream media seldom mentions, exclamation point." And that brings us to our politics lead. In the former Soviet Republic of Georgia today, Vice President Pence promised that President Trump would sign into law very soon the tough new sanctions on Russia that Congress passed overwhelmingly and delivered to the White House last Friday.
And in a further sign of our commitment, very soon President Trump will sign legislation to strengthen and codify the United States sanctions against Russia.
Pledges like that notwithstanding, Senate Republican sources tell me that they are concerned that President Trump might not sign the sanctions into law, though their worries are assuaged given the fact that they have enough votes to override were the president to veto the measure. And even if the president does nothing at all and just lets the bill sit, it will become a law in 10 days automatically. The president's seeming ambivalence on the Russian sanctions is intriguing, coming alongside a deafening silence, as it does, from President Trump about Moscow's recent retaliation to those same sanctions. President Vladimir Putin's order that the U.S. eliminate 755 staffers from the U.S. diplomatic mission there, the most aggressive move by the Kremlin against Washington since the final years of the Cold War. In the past few days, since the move by Putin, the president has had plenty to say about the news media, about Republican senators, about Democratic senators, and more. But the president has had nothing to say publicly about Putin or that move. Nor has the president had anything public to say today about a different Russia-related story. The Washington Post scoop that President Trump, quote, personally dictated that initial misleading statement from his son Donald Trump Jr. when first asked about that June 2016 campaign meeting with the Russians. We now know that the encounter happened because an associate of Donald Trump Jr. offered to get him a meeting with a Russian government lawyer who was promising incriminating information about Hillary Clinton. But that initial statement about the meeting was misleading. It suggested that Trump Jr. and the lawyer had, quote, primarily discussed a program about the adoption of Russian children, unquote. Now, that statement did not mention the purpose of the meeting and had to be updated after the New York Times obtained more evidence about the meeting and offered many more details. The Times had reported, of course, that President Trump personally signed off on that misleading statement, which at the time, one of the president's attorneys told me was not true. The New York Times also reporting that the president personally signed off on the original statement that Donald Trump Jr. issued on Saturday, that one that required a follow-up clarification because it didn't disclose the idea of opposition research.
Yeah, that's not true. First of all,
the president did not sign off on that statement.
The statement was issued by Donald Trump Jr. The president was on the return from his trip to the G20. Again, these are stories that are out there. People can say anything they want, but the fact is that's just not true.
Today, however, we found out from the Post that the president did more than look at Don Jr.'s misleading statement. He dictated it against the advice of his advisors, who favored a fuller disclosure about the meeting, suspecting that all the information was going to come out anyway, which it did. Now, asked for comment just a few minutes ago, the White House press secretary acknowledged what the president's lawyer denied, acknowledging that the president did play a role in the drafting of that misleading statement.
The statement that Don Jr. issued is true. There's no inaccuracy in the statement. The president weighed in as any father would based on the limited information that he had.
To be clear, of course, the statement that Don Jr. issued, that was dictated by the president, according to the Post, was misleading. It did not even remotely acknowledge the purpose of the meeting, which was Donald Trump Jr. wanting to meet someone billed as a Russian government lawyer with one specific purpose: to obtain dirt on Hillary Clinton. A meeting attended, by the way, by Jared Kushner and campaign chair Paul Manafort. Now, you as a citizen, you should expect a much higher standard of truth than the one that the White House press secretary just enunciated. If a meeting takes place so campaign officials can get dirt on a political rival from the Russian government, describing that meeting as being about adoption and not mentioning the purpose of the meeting, it's not true. It's inaccurate. It is so misleading as to be a lie. And you, as a citizen, you have every right to wonder, why would the president hide the truth and be inaccurate about this? Why would he want to hide from you the facts of this meeting, which they insist was innocent? And, as always, what does any of this have to do with making America great again? So how does the president's just weighing in, as we learned today, square with what we've been told in the past about the formulation of that initial misleading statement? CNN's Jim Acosta is looking into this evolving storyline from the White House.
Yes, the White House said the president was involved in the crafting of a misleading statement that initially obscured the true nature of his son Donald Trump Jr.'s meeting with a Russian lawyer during the campaign.
There's no inaccuracy in the statement. The president weighed in as any father would based on the limited information that he had.
The questions came after a Washington Post story reporting that the president dictated the statement released July 8th for Trump Jr., then inaccurately claimed the meeting was focused on Russian adoptions. We primarily discussed a program about the adoption of Russian children that was active and popular with American families years ago and was since ended by the Russian government. 3 days after that statement, Trump Jr. released 4 pages of his own emails showing the Russian attorney planned to provide information that, quote, would incriminate Hillary and her dealings with Russia and would be very useful to your father. Talking to reporters on Air Force One the next day, the president was still talking up the adoption explanation, saying they talked about the adoption stuff, which was actually a big thing at the time, but nothing happened. A story he was still using at a news conference the following day.
I guess they talked about, as I see it, they talked about adoption and some things. Adoption wasn't even a part of the campaign. But nothing happened from the meeting. Zero happened from the meeting. And honestly, I think the press made a very big deal over something that really a lot of people would do.
Say something. Asked about that initial misleading statement from Donald Trump Jr., White House outside counsel Jay Sekulow insisted the president was not involved.
That statement was, by the way, I wasn't involved in the statement drafting at all, nor was the president. I'm assuming that was between Mr. Donald Trump Jr., between Don Jr., and his lawyer. I'm sure his lawyer was involved. That's how you do it. And you know that. And so to put this on the president, I think is just absolutely incorrect.
Leaders from both parties say the president's involvement in his son's statement is yet another concern for the Russia investigation.
If it's true, I think it is of serious concern, but we don't know that it is.
If you'd had the emails available to you, you would understand that the whole meeting wasn't about adoption, that the email chain shows that it was about the Russian government wanting to help the Trump campaign. I don't think the statement helped Don Jr. I don't know what role the president played, if any. Here's what I would suggest, that when you put out a misleading statement, it's going to be hard to convince people to stop looking at other things.
The other big question lingering here at the White House is whether the president would sign a bill that would limit his ability to ease sanctions on Russia. Today, the White House said the president would sign that legislation. Congressional leaders were not very concerned the president would veto the bill. The measure has enough support in Congress to override any veto. And Jake, getting back to Donald Trump Jr.'s statement, for all the talk about the new chief of staff here bringing order and discipline to the White House, there's another thing that's in short supply over here, and that's honesty. Jake?
Jim Acosta, thank you so much. Let's turn now to Republican Senator Jeff Flake of Arizona, whose new book is rattling more than a few cages today. It is titled Conscience of a Conservative, A Rejection of Destructive Politics and a Return to Principle. Senator, thanks so much for being here. I have a different Conscience of a Conservative book at home by Barry Goldwater.
Like that one.
Barry Goldwater. It looks a lot like this one. Obviously, the content very different. Congratulations on the book.
Well, thank you.
I want to get to that in a second, but first, let's start with this news. The Washington Post reporting and the White House confirming that President Trump played a role in drafting this initial misleading statement about Donald Trump Jr.'s meeting with the Russians. What's your reaction?
I was surprised to hear that, but I know that the committees of jurisdiction, the Senate Intelligence Committee on a bipartisan basis is looking at this, as they should, and I'm sure Bob Mueller and others will as well. So, but it was a bit of a surprise.
Well, what about the fact that you have the president's lawyer going out there and telling people he did not play any role at all in the drafting of the statement, and now we're told that he did, and then also just the issue of the fact that the statement was misleading. It said it was just about adoptions, when obviously we know, as Lindsey Graham just said, that the purpose of the meeting was to get dirt on Hillary Clinton. Does this White House have a huge credibility gap?
Well, I would agree with Lindsey in that regard. It's tough to tell people not to look elsewhere if they don't believe that you're giving the full story. But we'll leave it to the committees of jurisdiction. I'm glad we have a bipartisan committee looking into this, and the Senate Intelligence Committee, and they're committed to do it, and others are as well. So,
Sarah Huckabee Sanders, the White House press secretary, was asked today if the credibility gap, these transparency and honesty issues, were hurting the Republican agenda. Take a listen to what she had to say.
I think what's hurting the legislative agenda is Congress's inability to get things passed.
What do you think?
Well, that's a pretty fair criticism. First and foremost, it's our responsibility to pass things. I think, have reached the limit of what we can do on health care with just our party. And so we're going to be reaching across the aisle, and perhaps we should have started that way, but that's where we're going.
What do you think of the new Chief of Staff, retired Marine General?
I'm glad he's there.
Yeah.
I think it's been a good start, and obviously the measures that have been taken so far, I think, will give us more confidence that we'll see a little less chaos over there, and that'll help. That'll help.
Let's turn to your book. You have a comment in here which was really fascinating. I mean, there's a lot of criticism about the president and his behavior and how Republicans, conservatives specifically, have dealt with him. At one point you write, quote, "To carry on in the spring of 2017 as if what was happening was anything approaching normalcy required a determined suspension of critical faculties and tremendous powers of denial." It's a pretty strong thing to say. Yeah. What do you think Republicans, conservatives, Americans should be doing?
Well, there are two parts of conservatism. The first, I would argue, is policy. We've always adhered to limited government, economic freedom, individual responsibility. Barry Goldwater in 1960 felt that the party was straying from those principles, and that's why he wrote the original Conscience of a Conservative. I think we're facing a similar crisis now, where we've kind of, as Republicans, taken up an unfamiliar banner that this populism and in some cases xenophobia, anti-immigration, protectionism. That's not familiar to us, and I don't think that is a governing philosophy. So on the policy side, I think we have an issue. But also, being conservative means, particularly in foreign policy, that you're steady and that you're measured in your use of diplomacy and force, and predictable, and that we embrace our allies and recognize our enemies. And that, I think, has been lacking, and I'm concerned about that.
I've heard from many Republicans on this show and also just talking in the green room who think that, in fact, the president's point of view is embracing our enemies and giving the stiff arm to our allies in a lot of ways.
Well, for those of us who were raised, in the Cold War, and having the Soviet Union, and now Russia adopting some of the same attitudes as the Soviet Union, and that was the existential threat. And now to be seen as, being more friendly or more trusting, and to distrust our own institutions of government, our intelligence communities, just seems foreign to us. And I think it should seem foreign to us. And I think we need, when we see that, to speak up more often.
Senator, stick around. We're going to take a very quick break. When we come back, we'll talk more about your book. Stay with us.
Aaron Burnett out front. Stories that matter.
You've got the money and you've got the passion, but how do you actually make a difference?
From the people making